We will talk about evolution in a moment, but I would like to start off with your other book, which is about God. And this book has been translated in 31 different languages. It's been selling very well in many countries, including very religious countries like Brazil. So the question comes to mind, do you think there are a lot of closet atheists out there hiding and embarrassed to expose themselves as non-believers?
I certainly hope so, and I do think so. I have traveled a lot in the United States promoting the God delusion, and I particularly have traveled in parts of the United States that are described as the Bible Belt. And so I was expecting to get a somewhat mixed reception, but in the event, everywhere I went, I got huge audiences, enormously enthusiastic, thousands of people, all apparently agreeing with me that there is no God and we'd be better off not believing in one. And I think that exactly as you say, there are lots and lots of closet atheists who, at least in the United States, have never really dared to stand up and say that's what they are. So when I go to a place like Oklahoma, which is said to be a very religious state, 3,000 people showed up in one hall, and they stood up at the end, and I think they looked at each other and they realized I'm not alone. There are others like me, even in Oklahoma.
Or even in Brazil, you could say. Where do you find the strongest resistance to your ideas, if not geographically, like Oklahoma and the Bible Belt, intellectually? Where do you find the challenge?
Well, I shouldn't leave you with the impression that I got no resistance in Oklahoma, by the way. There was a congressman in Oklahoma who tried to get my talk banned and tried to censure the University of Oklahoma for inviting me. So there was opposition from politically powerful forces. Serious opposition. I don't think there is a hell of a lot of serious opposition. There is, I think the most serious criticisms I get are from people who say, I'm an atheist, but, and I'm getting very, very used to that phrase, I'm an atheist, but, and they accuse me of being impolite, discourteous, not sufficiently sympathetic towards religious people. I think that's a misperception, by the way. I think that there is a general feeling, we've all been brought up to believe that you mustn't criticize religion. You cannot criticize religion. And therefore, even a fairly mild criticism of religion sounds aggressive, sounds strident, sounds shrill. Actually, I would like to think that The God Delusion is quite a funny book. I don't know whether the humor shows through in translation, but I hope so.
The book makes clear that you would prefer to see a world without religion. But then the argument comes from many people who say, well, how about the relief that religion provides to many people? Like people who have lost their loved one and think, well, at least I can meet them and on the other side.
Yes. I do think that's a serious point. People do undoubtedly get consolation from religion. The first thing to say about that is that because something is comforting and consoling, that doesn't, of course, make it true. It's obviously a logical fallacy to suggest that because something makes you feel good, that makes it true. There are those who would rather not hear the truth, and a good test would be, would you wish your doctor to tell you when you have a fatal disease? Some people would prefer not to know when they have a fatal disease. Some people would prefer their doctor to tell them. And doctors often make a judgment whether they're dealing with the kind of patient who needs to know the truth or the kind of patient who would prefer not to know the truth. So I think it's rather an analogous case. I don't think you could ever say that it would be a justification for not writing a book, the fear that somebody might be upset about it. If you're going to be upset about reading my book, don't read it.
How about the side argument that people say that is another plus of religion, is the fact that it has inspired magnificent works of art through the ages, you know, from the Sistine Chapel to the music of Bach, and I know you were a fan of Bach, and so do you think the inspiration is an important factor?
Yes, I mean, there's no doubt at all that religion has inspired great art, great music, great poetry, great literature. The Bible itself is great literature, certainly in the 17th century English, which I'm most familiar with, and my guess is that the Bible in Portuguese is probably great literature as well. I do feel very strongly that all children should learn about the Bible, should read the Bible, because you cannot appreciate literature, you can't appreciate European literature, you can't appreciate European history without knowing the Bible. And so that I feel very strongly. If we get rid of religion, then biblical history, biblical literature will go on being important in just the same way as the Greek gods are important for understanding literature. You can't appreciate much of literature unless you know about Zeus and Apollo. You can't appreciate Wagner unless you know about the Norse gods. Nobody believes in them anymore, but they're a part of our cultural heritage. Things like the Sistine Chapel, things like the music of Bach, well, that is, of course, very beautiful, very important. If you ask, does that in any way support the contention that there's some validity in religion? Of course it doesn't. Great artists go where the money is. And it's always been the case that rich people are able to commission the art that they want. And in the time of Michelangelo, in the time of Bach, the people who had the money were the churches. And so that's why great art was done for the churches. It doesn't, of course, make it true. I would even go so far as to say that the story, for example, of the St. Matthew Passion is a very, very moving story. It's not just the music of Bach that makes it moving. It is a moving story in itself, and one can, of course, appreciate the drama and the emotions of great fiction. You can still appreciate the Bible story even though they are fiction.
So as part of your interpretation of the Bible as fiction, the concept of the world being created in a few days, at a certain time about 6,000 years ago, all at once, that goes into an enormous contradiction with the evidence of science. So you think that is the part that should be rejected? Well,
the world is filled with beautiful origin myths, and anthropologists will give you hundreds, probably thousands of origin myths which have great poetic beauty and which are well worth studying as literature, as cultural artifacts. The particular origin myth that we're most familiar with, which is the Jewish one, which I think has its origins in Babylon, is no more beautiful, no less beautiful than any other. The astonishing thing, and I think it would have astonished Darwin, were he alive to see it still today, is that in many parts of the world that particular origin myth is believed literally. As you say, the world was created in 6 days, 6,000 years ago. Now that's not just slightly wrong, that is gigantically, colossally wrong. And a way to illustrate that is to say, since the true age of the world is 4.6 billion years, to believe that the world is only 6,000 years old is equivalent to believing that, I've calculated it, the width of North America from New York to San Francisco is 8 meters.
As an evolutionist, a Darwinist, you obviously don't believe in an afterlife, which is the inspiration for many people as a purpose of life. So in your concept, what is the purpose of life? Is it life itself?
Well, one kind of purpose of life, the biologist's one, is the one that is the basis of my first book, The Selfish Gene. And on that scientific level, the purpose of life is the propagation of DNA. And there is poetic inspiration in that, but it probably isn't going to be very satisfying to individuals. Individuals make their own purpose in life. Each one of us, to a greater or lesser extent, lives by our purposes. It may be to write a great book, a great symphony. It may be to win a football match. It may be to bring up your children in health and happiness. There are all kinds of purposes that individuals can make, every one of us can make. And we'd better make our own purposes, because this is the only life we're going to get. And so the belief that this is the only life we're going to get sharpens our view of the world. It makes us value life more. It makes us take life seriously, but it also makes us enjoy life to the full, because this is the only life we're going to get. And to lead this life in a less than full fashion, because you think you're going to get another one, is a terrible, terrible waste of the gigantic privilege it is to have a life at all. Because each of us are enormously privileged. If you calculate the odds against each one of us coming into existence, our parents had to meet. Not only did they have to meet, they had to have sexual intercourse at a particular time. A particular sperm had to find a particular egg. The same thing had to happen to our grandparents, our great-grandparents, all the way back through the pilgrimage to the origin of life. Not one of us here has any right to expect to exist. We do exist by a fantastic piece of good chance. Don't waste it. It's the only life you're going to get.
How about, there is a more controversial argument when you're discussing the purpose of life and the non-belief in an afterlife. It is when people say that if you don't believe in an afterlife and in religious principles, you cannot have moral principles. I know you don't quite accept that.
No, well, right. The idea that the only reason we are moral is that we believe in an afterlife, and therefore we are striving to be rewarded with the carrot of heaven or to avoid the stick of hell, which is what, in effect, you just said. What an ignoble reason for being good. What a terribly bad reason, what a terribly immoral reason for being moral. I was once on a radio program in the United States, and you had one of these phone-ins. People phone in with their questions. And one man in Texas phoned in and said that if he didn't believe in God, if he wasn't afraid of going to hell, he would murder his neighbor. So I said, you don't really mean that. You don't seriously mean that if it wasn't for the fear of God, you would go out and murder your neighbor. He said, absolutely I would. He said, I would go out and rape the next woman I saw. I cannot seriously believe that there are many people who are only held back from doing bad things by the fear of God. Christopher Hitchens, one of my colleagues who's written another book in much the same time called God is Not Great, he puts it like this. The Bible says, thou shalt not kill in the Ten Commandments. And he sarcastically remarks, do you really mean to say that when Moses came down from the mountain with the tablets that said, thou shalt not kill, people said, oh, thou shalt not kill. Oh, right. Oh, all right, we thought it was rather a good idea to kill. The other, yes, okay, I think I've said enough.
Yeah. In another book of yours, The Devil's Chaplain, also published in Brazil a few years ago. And by the way, you're not the devil's chaplain, you make it clear in the book. You write a letter to your daughter, who was then 10 years old, and you warn her against the influence of tradition, authority, and revelation. Please let us know about that.
Yes. You're right. My book, A Devil's Chaplain, is a reference to Darwin, who said, when he was talking about the cruelty of nature, and natural selection is cruel, he said, what a book a devil's chaplain might write on the low, blundering, cruel, horribly wasteful, I didn't get the words exactly right, ways of nature. So my book is called A Devil's Chaplain, but I don't want to be the devil's chaplain. The last chapter of the book, it's a collection of essays, mostly published before. The last essay in the book is this letter to my then 10-year-old daughter, Juliet. When I wrote the book, the collected essays, I presented it to her. She was the dedicatee on her 18th birthday. In that chapter, in that letter, open letter to her at the age of 10, I didn't specifically tell her to be an atheist. I would never do that. Children should not be indoctrinated. I did ask her to think for herself. I did try to explain, I think the opening lines of the chapter are, how do we know the things that we know? And I gave the answer, evidence. And I explained a bit from a scientific point of view what evidence is. And then I warned her against various bad reasons that people sometimes give for thinking that they know something. And these were revelation, tradition, and authority. I said, those are not good reasons to believe anything. The only good reason to believe something is evidence. I would like that book, that chapter to be read by any 10-year-old child. I am very, very keen not to indoctrinate children with atheism any more than they should be indoctrinated with religion. I think one of the most wicked things you can do to a child is to tell the child, you are a Christian child, you are a Muslim child, you are a Catholic child, or you are a Presbyterian child, whatever it might be. The child is too young to know. A child is too young to be a Catholic or a Muslim or a Protestant. Let the child grow up and decide for herself whether she wants to believe those things. If ever you hear somebody saying, that is a Catholic child, or that is a Protestant child, or that is a Muslim child, you should wince. It's consciousness-raising in the same kind of way as the feminists raised our consciousness. I don't know how it works in Portuguese, but in the English-speaking world, feminists have taught us, remarkably successfully, not to use the word man when we mean human, not to use the word he when we might mean she. It's very difficult to do in English, and it's probably even harder to do in more gendered languages. But the feminists have succeeded in raising our consciousness so that whenever we hear the future of man, we kind of wince, we kind of draw back and think, that's wrong, we shouldn't say that. And in exactly the same way, I would like everyone here to wince when they hear somebody talking about a Catholic child. There is no such thing as a Catholic child. There is a child of Catholic parents.
Well, touch upon another area of your work that some people might not be familiar with. Perhaps you can tell us about the importance of, in the context of science, the importance of poetry and literature.
I love poetry. I love language. I read poetry. I know a lot of poetry by heart. I don't really understand, although I love it, I don't quite understand what poetry is. I don't understand why it works. I'm haunted by it. It gives me goose pimples. It gives me shivers up the spine. But I still don't really quite understand it. I do think, and I've written a book about this called Unweaving the Rainbow. Perhaps the translator knows how that's actually translated into Portuguese. It may not be exactly the same. I'm sure that, that the word rainbow comes into it somewhere. That book, Unweaving the Rainbow, is my attempt to unite poetry and science and to advocate science as a worthy, more than worthy, subject for poets, one that I feel poets have neglected. Of course, love is a great theme for poetry, and even religion is a great theme for poetry, but science might be an even greater one, and one that hasn't been really exploited by poets.
Since we're here in a festival that celebrates books like yours, there's also, as you mentioned in the beginning, this is the 105th anniversary of Charles Darwin's The Origin of the Species. It was a revolutionary work. But very often revolutionary works are very difficult for people to understand, not only because it's new, but sometimes even the language is complicated. Karl Marx, Das Kapital, the first volume is almost unreadable. If you can get through and read second and third, you understand it, but the first one was very complicated. Do you think The Origin of the Species is a complicated book?
No. I think that The Origin of Species is very unusual in a pioneering book. It is very easy to understand. It's written in Victorian English, which is a little bit more long-winded than we're used to today. But the moment you open it, you realize that Darwin was really, really trying to be understood. He wanted to be understood by ordinary people. Not every scholar, unfortunately, has that laudable aim. Darwin thought about his book for a very long time before he wrote it. People often wonder why he waited such a long time after he first wrote down his theory in a reasonably full form in 1844. He then waited until 1859 before he actually published the book. And even then, he was pushed into it by the fact that Wallace, another English naturalist who traveled in South America as Darwin did, independently thought of the idea. Why did Darwin wait so long? One idea is that he wanted to wait so long because he really was trying to gather together all the evidence to make it totally convincing and write it down in a totally understandable way. He was planning to write a much bigger book, and it was The Origin of Species was actually what he called the abstract of his much bigger book. And he wrote it in 1859 because in 1858 Wallace sent him a letter which was identical to his own theory. And as you may know, there was a very gentlemanly solution to the possible priority dispute. Papers by Darwin and Wallace were read out on the same day at the Linnean Society in London. However, on that occasion, in 1858, nobody took any notice. It had to wait for the book, The Origin of Species, which was published the following year in 1859. Then everybody sat up and took notice.
As you mentioned, Darwin was a Victorian, a product of his time. And in part of his writings, he implies the superiority of man in relation to women. Pretty much a bit like Freud did, also a Victorian. So you think they were both, or at least Darwin, kind of products of their times, and their science suffered.
Yes, Darwin was a Victorian, and like all Victorians, he showed traces of what we would today recognize as sexism and racism. This was absolutely normal at the time. And of course, any historian worth her or his salt would learn to read without being offended by that. Darwin and Wallace were actually much less racist than many of their contemporaries. Darwin fought against slavery very vigorously, for example. But as for the sexism, as for the regarding of women as inferior, I find it an astonishing fact that in most countries of the world, women didn't get the vote until well into the 20th century. I don't know when they got the vote in Brazil. In Britain, I think it wasn't until the 1920s. The United States, it wasn't until the 1920s. I think of major Western countries, only New Zealand and some states of Australia had women voting towards the end of the 19th century. So it was standard to be sexist and racist. Even Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, who was right in the vanguard of liberal, radical, progressive opinion in his time, reads today like the most terrible racist that you could imagine. No, not the most terrible you could imagine. He was only moderately, but he would say things like, of course, nobody would seriously maintain that our dusky cousins could possibly match us for intellectual ability, that kind of thing. Now that was progressive opinion, liberal opinion for its time. You can imagine what the less progressive opinion was like. To me, this is a very encouraging indicator of how the zeitgeist moves really quite rapidly. Even going back to, well, within my lifetime and before, if you read fiction, detective fiction of the 1920s, Agatha Christie, Bulldog Drummond, you find what sounds the most atrocious racism in these books, just absolutely normal and accepted in the 1920s. How things change, how rapidly things change. In The God Delusion, I make this the basis for an argument against the suggestion which you raised earlier, that you need religion in order to be moral. The fact that the moral zeitgeist moves so rapidly from decade to decade, and we all move together whether we're religious or not. In the 1920s, a lot of people would have been racist and sexist whether they were religious or not. Today, most educated people are at least much less so whether they're religious or not. We move on with great rapidity, with dramatic rapidity, and religion doesn't seem to have anything to do with it. I think it's a fairly telling piece of evidence.
We understand from the studies of people like Noam Chomsky and others that, for instance, we have humans are hardwired for language, in the case of Chomsky. It's in our genes. But there's been a tendency to attribute a lot of characteristics, a lot of traces of our personality, of the way we are, to evolution. Do you think people are going overboard with that?
It's always been a problem, this swinging backwards and forwards in this particular argument. It tends to be correlated with one's position on the political spectrum, left to right. Chomsky is an interesting case because he's a man of the left, very definitely, in politics, a very highly effective spokesman for the left in America, and also in linguistics, however, he is associated with the view that, as you say, language acquisition is hardwired in our genes. It's important not to misunderstand that. Of course, it doesn't mean that we are born knowing a language. Everybody knows that's not true. But we are born with neural machinery which is hardwired, eager to learn language, has the capacity to construct grammar, and it's very easy for it to construct grammar when the child hears grammatical language spoken. The chimpanzee studies that have been done teaching chimpanzees things like American Sign Language, the language of the deaf, it's controversial. Nobody denies that these chimpanzees can learn a very large vocabulary of a couple of hundred words from the sign language dictionary, but most linguists do not accept that these chimpanzees are capable of the sort of hierarchical syntax, the recursive syntax, which Chomsky has uncovered, Chomsky and others have uncovered in human language. It seems that the human brain is uniquely hardwired to do syntax, to generate it and to understand it and to read it. How
about other traces of personality?
Well, the evidence you can get on other traces of personality are, for example, twin studies. You know that monozygotic twins, identical twins that are formed by the splitting of a fertilized egg, so they have all the same genes. If you compare how alike twins are, identical twins are, and compare that with how alike non-identical twins are, dizygotic twins are, then you can get a measure for the importance of genes in determining variation. So if you take something like eye color, if you know the eye color of one twin, you absolutely know the eye color of the other twin if they're monozygotic, but if they're dizygotic, you don't. They might have opposite eye colors. So with eye color, the heritability is 1. that you can obtain a figure for heritability. This is a number that tells you how predictable the one twin is if you know what the other twin is. That would be one way to put it. And things like intelligence, as measured by various IQ metrics, tend to have a fairly high heritability, but it isn't one. So if you know the IQ of one twin, if they're identical twins, you've got a pretty good idea that the other one will be the same, but it won't be exactly the same. And things like musical ability, mathematical ability, sexual orientation, people have looked at the resemblance between monozygotic twins compared to dizygotic twins with respect to each of these characteristics, and obtained a heritability score somewhere between 1, which means absolute heritability, and 0, which means that if you know the characteristics of one twin, it tells you absolutely nothing about the characteristics of the other twin. So the truth is somewhere in between 0 and 1, and it varies between 0 and 1 in different characteristics. What's wrong is to think that because something has a degree of statistical genetic determination, that therefore it's somehow any more irrevocable and unchangeable than any other kind of determination. If, for example, you found that there are genes for religious belief, if there's one twin is religious, the other one tends to be religious, there is some evidence for that. It could very well be that that is an important effect, but that environment could be even more determinate. That if children are exposed to nuns in their early childhood, it could be even harder to shake it off later than if you have genes that make you religious. So there's nothing magical, there's nothing super deterministic about genes.
Still on this subject of the tendency to apply evolution to other areas, a key area, of course, is society. And in your book, A Devil's Chaplain, that we mentioned before, you wrote that, as a scientist, I'm a Darwinian, but in politics and how we conduct our affairs, I'm a passionate anti-Darwinian. Can you explain that?
Yes. That actually is the meaning of the central message of the essay called A Devil's Chaplain, which is the opening essay of that book, and the only one that I wrote anew for that book. There has been a tendency for people to take the Darwinian theory of natural selection, which is how life came into being, and to apply it in human politics and human society as though the discovery of what is natural somehow makes it good and something that we ought to emulate in our politics and our society. Social Darwinism is a phrase that came into use. I think Herbert Spencer started it in the 19th century, and it became influential towards the end of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, for example, in the case of Hitler. The idea that because in nature the survival of the fittest is what puts together the hunting grace of a leopard and the equally graceful fleeing muscles and limbs of the antelope. Natural selection, the survival of the fittest, is what has put the natural world together. But if you try to say, therefore, we want to plan our society on Darwinian lines, the weakest go to the wall, the fittest survive, the strongest must win. This is social Darwinism. This was promulgated by, for example, John D. Rockefeller, the early 20th century oil magnate in America. The idea that it's somehow moral to be ruthless, it's somehow moral to be selfish, moral to be strong and to destroy the weak. That's the kind of society I absolutely don't want to live in. And so not a bad touchstone for the kind of society we don't want to live in would be a Darwinian society. I said in The Selfish Gene, let's learn about Darwinism not just because it's the truth about how life evolved, but we learn about Darwinism as a way to learn what to avoid when we plan our politics and our societies.
There's some questions here from the audience, if you don't mind. Let's get to them. From Antonio Cardoso Neto. Do you have some theory about the origin of conscience, the so-called big problem, and quote unquote?
The origin of consciousness is the big problem. It's the hard problem. I don't have a theory about it. If I did, I would win the Nobel Prize. I think that it's philosophically difficult to even identify what the problem is. You could imagine a computer that, indeed, computer programs have been written that do very intelligent things like play chess, but I think nobody believes that when they're playing chess against a computer that it feels anything. They don't believe that it feels mortification when it misses a good move or something of that sort. So you can have intelligence without consciousness. Why do we have consciousness? Why do we have the sensation of redness? It's easy to see why we might have sense organs that distinguish wavelength of light. It's useful to distinguish light of different wavelengths. But why does it have to be red? Why does it have to have that peculiar red quality, which I can't describe to you, but I know what it is and you know what it is because you have it inside your own head? We don't even know whether the way I see red is the same way you see red, and that's a philosophical chestnut which may never be answered. What is this idea of self-awareness, this feeling that there is a me lurking somewhere behind my eyes? The Greeks thought it was in your chest, by the way. There's an I, there's a me that's lurking inside me. There's a you that's lurking inside you. And I don't know what it's like to be you. I just guess that it must be a bit similar to being me. These are philosophically very difficult questions. As a biologist, a materialist, Darwinian biologist, I'm committed to the view that it all happens in the brain. It's created by the activity of neurons in the brain, but I'm as baffled as anybody else as to exactly how that happens.
Teasing here from Paula Fadu. She wants to know if you're afraid of death.
I'm not looking forward to the process of dying, mainly because, unlike my dog and your horse and your cat, I will not have the privilege of being able to go to the vet and be painlessly put to sleep. I want to die under general anesthetic, and because I'm human, I'm unique among species in not being allowed to do that. There is a widespread bigotry against euthanasia or assisted suicide, which means that most of us are condemned to suffer when we die, whereas our pets are allowed to die under a general anesthetic. So I am not looking forward to dying. As for being dead, I shan't miss life. As Mark Twain said, I was dead for billions of years before I was born and never suffered the slightest inconvenience. If I were told that I was going to die very soon, I would be deeply disappointed because I love life and I intend to go on loving life for as long as possible, so I would indeed be very disappointed. I don't think that's quite the same as fear. It is disappointment. If I were religious, I might very well be afraid of death because I might very well be afraid of what was coming to me after death. I have an Australian friend who once rather irreverently and unkindly remarked that if you go into churches, you very often see very old people, and he expressed it as, I try to do the Australian accent, which may not come across the translation, cramming for the final.
Oh, well, I guess along those lines we could as part of the fantasy world, if indeed you died and all of a sudden you found yourself in front of God, what would you tell him?
Well, the first thing I think I'd say is, which God are you? Are you Baal or Zeus or Thor or Wotan or Mithras or Apollo or an Aztec god or a Maori god, Australian Aboriginal god? So the next thing I would say is what Bertrand Russell said when asked a similar question: not enough evidence, God, not enough evidence.